Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Harry Potter fan fiction. This particular one comes to you yet again from the Cassandra Clare archive. This one was actually written by her and a couple of her other friends, Heidi and Stacy. And I don't really think that I have anything too crazy to report in this one, except that it is a little dark here and there. So, if the dark subject matter within fanfiction bothers you, it might be a good idea to sit this one out. But without further ado, let's just get started. Expecto Patronum. Author's notes. We know it's much longer than 5,000 words, but there were 3 authors, so we sorta decided to put it up as is instead of splitting it into 3 sections. We know we only got away with it because we're mods. We don't bend the rules often, do we? Note the second. This is the start of a multi-chaptered fic that we don't have time to finish right now, which is why we're not uploading it onto AT itself. But who knows? Maybe we will. She was flying, and it was wonderful. She was snuggled next to... She wasn't sure. It was night, and the starlight wasn't enough to see more than the vaguest outlines of clouds and raindrops that she could hear, but which didn't seem to dampen her clothes, her body, or her spirit. So glorious, so wonderful, she thought, so safe, here in the air with her dreams. Of course it was a dream, Ginny thought as she opened her eyes slowly. She knew it was. She wouldn't dare be up in the air, no matter who she was with. Not since Tom. After that horrible year, when she'd gone home for the summer, everyone had been so solicitous, as if she was recovering from a particularly nasty bout of Agrippa, name for the magimedicologist who had developed the first pepper-up potion used to recover from the malady. Not as if she'd nearly... She still couldn't think the word. Even the twins were moderately calm around her, and nobody, not even Ron, ever asked why she stopped playing Quidditch with them in the paddock, or why she wouldn't even fly with Molly to the apothecary in Chudley. Maybe they all just thought that if she rested for the summer, she'd be willing to do all those things she used to do. And they were right, at least about most of the things. As the days and weeks went by, more of the memories slipped from her conscious mind, as if they didn't bear thinking about. In mid-July, she started feeding the chickens again, and a few days later, she picked up her wand and, with Percy's help, started to catch up on all the things she'd missed during the year. There were a lot of things she needed to learn. Flying was the most difficult of all. Perhaps if the car was still there, she might have been willing to take a trip in that. She never had, and was jealous of Ron for having done it. Why hadn't they asked her to join them on that last flight the summer before? One morning, before anyone, even Percy, had awoken, she went to the broom shed and stood in front of Ron's shooting star for almost an hour, not touching it, just looking. Then all the things she thought she'd forgotten swam back into her mind in a stroke. The image of Colin, or of Hermione, lying petrified in the hospital wing. Tom coming out of the diary. Harry covered with blood. Harry, who she flew with in her dreams. It was usually him who she dreamed about, but he looked so much like Tom that it was difficult to look at him without focusing only on the physical differences between the two of them. The glasses, the wonderful green eyes, that scar. She had her own scar now, where Tom's wandless curse had smashed into her neck, snapping it back as he stepped from the pages into the chamber. It was low enough that it was covered by her robes most of the time, and she was bound and determined to make sure that it stayed that way. She'd practiced her charms so secretly, trying to get better, so she'd be able to disguise it some way. It didn't work. It was still there, that crowned snake. At least it looked nothing like the Dark Mark, and from what she'd learned from Ron since the Twilight Wizard Cup, it didn't act like it either. It hadn't burned or changed color or pulsed or anything. It was just there, only visible when she looked in the mirror. And even the mirror had stopped mentioning it by now. It only took her 2 years. 2 years? Had it really been 2 years since she'd flown? Professor McGonagall had allowed her out of flying class that was mandatory for everyone who didn't play Quidditch through both her second and third years, but had reminded her before she left Gryffindor Tower in June that she'd have to start flying again this year. What a humiliation it was, mused Ginny. She'd been on a baby broom when she was 2, but now she couldn't fly at all. She just simply couldn't do it. Dawn had broken. She'd seen the first fingers of light over the horizon, the way the sky faded from black to gray to peach and rose. Summers here at the Burrow were beautiful in the mornings, a different color than there was at Hogwarts. Hogwarts was lemon yellow and green in fall and spring, and every shade of blue in the winter. At home, though, red and purple were the colors of the day. It was still faintly purple when Ginny climbed out of bed. She'd been up for over 3 hours by now, reading books, flipping through magazines, being quiet as a mouse. After 3 years in a dorm with 4 other girls, she'd learned how to be completely quiet when she woke up early, even though she didn't have to worry as much at home. Everyone was used to strange noises in the night, and everyone but Percy was good at sleeping through them. As she walked down the stairs to the kitchen, she heard noises through Percy's door. He was probably getting ready to go to the office. He loved being the first one in, she knew, as much as he liked being the last one to leave in the evenings. Ginny wasn't sure what Percy had to do all day, now that the departments had been shifted around since the announcement that Barnabas Crouch had died. Of course, the announcement had been false. It said he died in his sleep after a long illness. Ginny knew better. Ron hadn't told her anything, of course, but she'd heard her parents talking. Their voices were soft and concerned, but not as worried as they sounded in their regular discussions about the twins' mishaps. Ginny didn't think things were completely out of control. At least they weren't yet. She knew better than anyone else, though, how easily control could slip away. She wasn't worried about Tom anymore, at least not in a personal way. He'd had his fun with her. What more need could he have for her now that she'd learned how to fight him off, thanks to Professor Lupin? Second year, he'd spoken to her after class that first week, and let her know that he knew what had happened with Tom in the spring. He spoke about her reaction to the Dementors. Of course, she already knew what Dementors did to wizards and witches, but Professor Lupin made sure to meet with her twice that fall, after classes, to demonstrate ways to determine whether an object was possessed before opening it, or even picking it up. She'd only practically applied his tricks with Fred and George's candies, and had the unique distinction of being the only person in the family who had never been transfigured into something else because of a sweet. The owls weren't back yet. She noted the summer before that Percy sent Hermes to deliver notes to Penelope every evening, about an hour after he went to his room, but Errol rarely traveled farther than the Prewitts anymore, and was probably chasing, but not catching, mice in the yard. After Pig got back and rested, Ginny needed to send him off to Collins with a book she'd borrowed on the train the week before. Ron let Ginny use Pigwidgeon to stay in touch with her friends, and the twins seemed to have their own way of communicating with Lee and their Quidditch teammates, but Angelina Johnson was coming to spend the first week at the Burrow. Percy, Bill, and Charlie were conspiring to buy their parents a new owl for their anniversary at the start of August, and she really wanted to chip in a bit. But buying a new cape to spruce up her old spring robes on her last visit to Hogsmeade took all the pocket money she'd been saving all year, so she was skint. Hence the borrowing from Colin. As she nibbled her pasty, she filled the owl cups with treats and cool water. If Tiny Pig was to carry a bulky book, charmed to be as light as a small scroll, he needed to be fortified. She was just turning to put the treat box back into the pantry when a soft hooting called her attention to the window. Pig had mail. The scroll had scrunched up until it looked like an origami dragon captured in his little claws, but at least he hadn't poked a hole through the letter. He had, however, completely lost the ribbon. It wasn't Jenny's fault that the parchment had gotten twisted a bit without its ribbon, or that some of the words were now on the outside of the scroll where she couldn't help but read them. They were just sitting there, demanding to be read, insisting that they tell her what Harry had to say, and that Harry was not to go more than 3 blocks from the Dursleys until Professor Lupin... No, it wasn't Ginny's fault. It was Pigwidgeon's. Of course, she had to see how Professor Lupin factored into this. Since the first defense class last fall, none of her classmates had spoken about him much, but she did idly wonder what he was doing. Maybe Harry had told Ron, and then she could send Professor Lupin a note about Fred and George's tricks and the good job she'd been doing in avoiding them. There wasn't anything wrong with that, was there? She'd just glance at that sentence and see if Harry mentioned where Professor Lupin was, and she could straighten up the look of the scroll, too. She unrolled the crumpled parchment and flattened it out by running her chipped tea mug along the edges and through the middle. The creases were new and the parchment thick, so as she slowly moved the mug along the page, they smoothed themselves out, and Ginny resolved to tie a nice fresh ribbon on it before putting it back in Ron's box. Her eyes scanned the page for the word Lupin and tried not to read the other words, although she caught a few mentions of a dog named Snuffles. Harry had a dog? Where did it live when he was at school? Until she finally saw it towards the top. Dumbledore had a letter waiting for me when I got here last week. Said I have to keep my windows closed at all times, and that I'm not to go more than 3 blocks from the Dursleys until Professor Lupin comes to collect me in about a week. I won't be able to come to the Burrow, but you'll be able to visit me. Of all the things I thought might happen this summer, learning that I inherit a stable on my birthday wasn't on the list. Yes, I have a stable now, with horses and everything. Back in the 1600s, one of my father's great-great-great-uncles owned something called La Chaise Stables. It's not far from Cornwall, in a gin and pop game, and Dumbledore's been holding it for me until I turned 15. Even though that won't be until late this summer, he's asked Professor Lupin to take over the accounting and anti-muggle charms from the people who've been running it all this time, although he can't go near the horses, I bet, and says I can go and live there instead of here at the Dursleys. He wants me to take my mind off of things. I'm going in about a week, and there's a dorm there where Lupin says I'll have a room, and Snuffles may come and stay a bit. Have you ever been on a horse? I've never ridden one. Only that centaur first year, remember? And Buckbeak, of course. I'm going to, though, if it means I get away from the Dursleys. The letter went on about the Dursleys and their neighbours for a bit, but Ginny didn't read any more. The letter was all flattened out again, and the wrinkles were gone, and she heard someone on the stairs. If someone came down now, she'd have no excuse for reading Ron's private mail. She quickly rolled the scroll up and put a ribbon from the posty drawer to fasten around it, then slipped it into Ron's box, and was back at the table with a glass of fresh pumpkin juice before Percy breezed in to make an apple butter sandwich. None of her other brothers ever came down before Percy left, if they could help it. Actually, Bill would, but he'd left 2 days ago, and probably wouldn't be back for months. It had been nice of him to stay in England until they got back from Hogwarts, but the goblins needed him back. He said something about a curse on a sandcastle, but wouldn't be more specific around any of them, especially the twins. So by the time Ron, Fred, and George made it to the table, Percy and their father had already left for the ministry, and Ginny was helping Molly organize the jelly jars for a midsummer canning. Pig had finished his treats and flown off a while back, so Ron didn't even notice that he had mail until Ginny mentioned it. As it was from Harry, she hoped he would read it aloud so that she would get to legitimately hear what Harry had written, act surprised about the stable, and even ask the questions that had been fluttering around her mind since she'd opened the letter. Ginny could tell when Ron reached that interesting part of the letter, as he swore under his breath. then looked at his mom guiltily, hoping she hadn't heard. Naturally she had, and assioed the letter out of his hands to see what would make her son behave in such a manner. Ron folded his arms and apologized, but looked nothing but disgruntled. Their mother didn't give him the letter back immediately, but turned to read it, making a few tut-tut and noises as she did. "I'm not surprised," she murmured as she finished the scroll. "Why not, Mum?" he asked, trying to sound conversational. He hadn't read the whole thing and clearly wanted to. "I remember that stable," she answered. "Charlie worked there about 8 years back." "Oh, I remember," Ginny interjected suddenly. "You brought us there one day so we could see the ponies and maybe even ride an axebran, but Fred and George insisted on sitting backwards in the saddle, so we never got the chance," she finished wistfully. "You took us home, and we didn't even get to see the ponies fly." "Maybe this summer you'll have a chance," the mum said, then turned to Ron. "Professor Dumbledore thinks it would be a good idea for you to visit Harry the week of his birthday, and I—" "You knew he owned the stable, and you never told me?" Ron sounded accusatory. "I only known about it a few days myself," she replied in a distracted voice. "The headmaster sent me an owl telling me that he'd worked it out with the Bones family, that they will stay on to manage the place for at least 4 more years, if Harry is able to live there this summer. You do know that there are protection spells when he's with his aunt and uncle?" Ginny hadn't known this, but Ron nodded his head. "So, are there spells to protect him there too?" Mrs. Weasley looked grave but didn't answer Ron's question. Instead she said, "Those protections only exist when he's with blood relatives, but Professor Dumbledore thinks he'll be just as safe on his old family land, which is why this seems like such a good idea. Professor Lupin will be nearby, although he can't go near the horses because of his condition." Her tone returned to normal as she went on with a slightly different topic. "Now that we know that Harry is occupied for the summer and will be taken care of, let's worry about the 2 of you." Ron and Ginny exchanged glances. Usually they traded the look when she was going on about Percy, or the twins. They rarely used it when both of them were in the lamplight. "Ron, I think this summer you can help your father reorganize his workshop. No, don't interrupt. He's acquired so many muggle things over the past 3 years. I don't recognize anything he's working on, and I'm half afraid he doesn't either. I can't see a way for either of us to understand what all those muggle things are, but you've got a wonderful resource." Ron looked completely blank, as if he couldn't tell what their mother was hinting at. "Huh?" he said. "Hermione, of course. You can write to her and ask if she can send you some muggle books about—" She stopped to think about the correct word, and went on as if she didn't hear her son choke on his pumpkin juice and blush a deep red. "Ah, yes, Texology. I think you've sent her only 1 note since the end of term. I'm sure she's looking forward to hearing from you. Honestly, Ginny's written to her more often than you have." "But, Mum, she hasn't written to me either. I'm sure she's busy studying or travelling or maybe—" Ginny wanted to rescue Ron from what was clearly an uncomfortable conversation, so she turned the subject to the possibility of Ron visiting Harry at the stables. She congratulated herself on hiding her knowledge of the letter's contents, although she did want to learn more about why Harry said he'd ridden a centaur. Ron just said, then asked, "Mum, may I have the letter back? If I'm going to visit Harry, I should let him know about it." He pulled his wand out and said, "Accio," and so the letter flew back into his hand. He scrutinized the contents with a more intense expression than Ginny had ever seen him apply to anything other than Quidditch. This left Ginny the object of her mother's focus, which had taken a very unexpected turn. "I think you should get a job this summer, Ginny dear." "A job?" Ginny couldn't imagine what her mum was going on about. Witches didn't work in the summer. They worked so hard on their studies at school and were supposed to spend their summer making crowns of flowers and drawing and reading Magic Mag and writing secret notes in their diaries. She wanted to do all of those ordinary things. Well, maybe not the diary, but the rest of them. Anyhow, what sort of job could there be for a 14-year-old witch who was officially not allowed to use her magic during the summer? Mrs. Weasley answered her question before she could even ask it. A job at the Lachais stables, of course. Charlie worked there 2 summers and loved it. You could learn all about the animals. You've done so well in your Care of Magical Creatures class. Ginny was sure she was as red as Ron had been, and so steered clear of the real reason the idea of the job at the stables made her nervous. Everyone does well in Hagrid's class, even the Slytherins who never pay attention. He's too nice to give anyone a bad mark. Her mother waved a hand dismissively. It'll be good for Harry having someone there he knows. He knows Susan Bones, Ginny protested. She's always going on about how her father is the director of the Auxabrand polo circuit, and how she's been riding since she was born. Plus, she's in his year, so he knows her a sight better than he knows me, she continued, although she knew she was lying. Harry probably paid less attention to Susan than he did to Ginny. At least he knew who Ginny was, and had rescued her from the Chamber of Secrets. Nevertheless, it'll be good for you to spend the summer doing something fun, and you'll make some pocket money for next term. You mean work there? Ginny heard herself ask. For pay? That's too embarrassing. I couldn't. That means I'd be working for Harry. It would be so awkward, and I don't want to. You're being ridiculous, her mum retorted. I'm his best friend's little sister, and you're going to send Ron there as a guest. Don't you think it'll be a little awkward for me to be paid by Ron's best friend, who's been a guest here, She paused. Who you what? Ginny stammered, searching for a word other than like. I just don't want to make things awkward for Ron or Harry. Ron had been engrossed in his letter, but when he heard Ginny say his name, he looked up. Would it be awkward for you if Ginny went to work at the Lachais for the summer? The mother asked him. Ron was, as usual, oblivious to Ginny's concerns. Course not. Why would it? He asked. He's your friend, Ron, Ginny said, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. And I don't want to take money from your best friend. You complain often enough about Harry's generosity and how awkward it makes you feel, so you should understand my issues with it. You wouldn't be taking, you'd be earning, Ron pointed out. And then you can share with me, he replied with a bright smile. If it bothers you that much, you can quit on July 30th, the day before he officially owns the place, the mother put in. Until then, consider yourself working for Dumbledore or for the Bones family. She raised her hand to stop Ginny's protestations. And no complaints about working for your schoolmate's family. She's in a different year and a different house from you anyway. Ginny could see that she was going to lose the argument. Can only hope for her complete lack of experience around horses would be enough to keep her from getting the job. It was as if Harry had stepped straight from hell into heaven. After an ugly scene at the Dursleys, where Uncle Vernon had been less than civil to Remus Lupin with his worn robes and long hair, they had portkeyed straight to Lachais stables, taking all of his things with them. The relief Harry felt at leaving the Dursleys only heightened as he picked himself off the ground at the end of their journey and stood up, gazing wide-eyed at the scene before him. They had landed behind a substantial farmhouse in a grassy, sunny yard filled with flowers and apple trees. It stood atop a small rise, and he could see the whole of the stable property spread out before him. Neat, tidy blocks and outbuildings in a private valley, copses of young trees nearby, and a mature forest beyond. A large, sunny paddock and endless fields stretched away into a bright azure sky, scuttled with fluffy summer clouds. And the horses, soaring majestically into the boundless blue sky, wings spread in silent flight, hooves beating on invisible ground. They were like nothing Harry had ever seen. Far more beautiful than hippogriffs, certainly, and 10 times more exciting than even his firebolt. He immediately wished to see them up close. Well, Harry, what do you think? Chuckled Lupin, who had brushed himself off and stood by the boy's trunk, watching his wide-eyed wonder. "It's beautiful," Harry burst out. "The horses, the valley, everything. I love it. I could stay here the rest of my life." Lupin laughed. "Well, that's easy enough to arrange. The place is yours, after all." Harry joined him in his laughter, and Lupin clapped a hand on his shoulder as the two made their way to the stables. Lupin introduced him to some of the grooms, who were mostly people he knew from school, and 2 old men in charge of the Abraxians. When Harry expressed his desire to see the horses, they took him to see the small collection of Muggle horses instead, as all the flying ones were being exercised. They magicked a saddle onto a tall, beautiful Arabian, and let Harry mount him in the paddock. They needn't have worried about his safety, as within minutes Harry looked as if he'd been on a horse his whole life, his natural athletic ability adapting almost immediately to the animal beneath him. Soon he was cantering easily around the paddock. Lupin and the grooms stood in the center, watching him admiringly, until he wheeled up to them, pulling the horse to a halt. "You're a natural, my boy," the old groom Thorpe congratulated Harry. "I've never seen anyone take quicker to riding," agreed his partner, Tinley. "How do you like it, Mr. Potter?" It's so cool," Harry gasped, too excited to be articulate. They all laughed at his excitement. Lupin was especially happy to see Harry flushed and smiling. From what Dumbledore had told him, Harry had been silent and depressed after his recent encounter with Voldemort. "Harry, why don't you go for a ride? I'll see to your things and get them taken to your dormitory," Lupin offered. He wanted the boy to enjoy himself in his new home right away. "I also need to send some owls and let people know we're arrived safely." "Thank you, Professor." Harry gave them all a dazzling smile and steered his horse away from them in ever-widening circles until he was cantering again. The grooms arranged to saddle a horse and have someone accompany Harry on a longer ride out into the countryside, assuring Lupin that Harry would be safe as long as he stayed in the valley, where the property's protection, including unplottable spells and anti-Muggle charms, would keep him from harm. Lupin waved to Harry and made his way back to the farmhouse, smiling to himself. If the rest of the summer was as good as the last hour, he would be very happy for Harry indeed. Really, Ginny thought, a girl should never underestimate the resources of a mother with a plan. That evening, the same day the letter had arrived, Mrs. Weasley had intercepted Hermes before he went to Penelope's house, so he could deliver a letter from her to Philippa Bones, who'd been in her class at Hogwarts. She and her husband had managed the stables even when Harry's parents were still alive. Ginny presumed they'd been doing it, at least since the Potters went into hiding. She'd also asked Arthur to send her a letter to Charlie before he left the office, in hopes that he could put in a good word for his sister at the stables as well. 3 days later, a response arrived from Mrs. Bones, asking Ginny to come to Cornwall for an interview the following Monday. Ginny thought her mother would be pleased, but while reading the letter, Ginny heard her muttering about her friend's silly need to force people to fly through unnecessary hoops. Ginny wasn't completely sure she wanted the job or not. Despite Ron's assurances, she was positive that it would be awkward working for Harry, even 1 degree removed. Acting like a common and indifferent acquaintance at school was one thing. They were in different years, didn't have any classes together, and sat at different sections of the table at most meals. Ginny wasn't completely sure how different the stables would be, or whether the employees would interact much with their new owner, or how anything would be organized at all. Her books were of no help, and Hermione, who was her usual resource for information, wouldn't have any first-hand knowledge of something like this either. She traveled and studied most summers, and as far as Ginny knew, had never worked anywhere but her parents' office. Even though she'd expected to be sleepless on Sunday night, she sank almost instantly into a deep and dreamless slumber, which left her feeling rested in the morning, but somehow out of sorts. Mrs. Weasley didn't think it a good idea to send her via flu, even though the job itself was a somewhat messy one. There was no need to be soot-covered for the interview. Mrs. Bones had sent a portkey in her letter, so at the appointed hour of 11 a.m., Ginny gathered her school report from the past year, which showed excellent marks in care of magical creatures and herbology, both of which would be useful around animals, and picked up the gilded horseshoe that had been sitting on the mantelpiece, awaiting her touch. She loved the feeling of tumbling through space and time, and always traveled with her eyes open as long as possible. It never took more than a moment to travel this way, but the spinning sensation always lasted a bit longer. Ginny was still focusing her eyes on the small white room she'd landed in when a smiling face appeared within view. "You must be Ginny," said a woman with short, wind-blown hair and dark, laughing eyes. "I'm Mrs. Bones, and I'm pleased to welcome you to La Chaise." "It's good to be here," Ginny replied, shaking Mrs. Bones's hand. Her riding robes were somewhat messy and disheveled, which gave Ginny a moment's relief. She'd been worried that everyone in the chaise would look like a photograph in Witch Weekly, with red robes over black riding breeches and perfectly polished riding boots, and knew she didn't have anything in her wardrobe to suit that. If the standards were more like what Mrs. Bones was wearing, Ginny knew she'd be fine. "Where are your things, dear?" Mrs. Bones went on. "My things? The letter didn't say I had to bring anything for the interview, did it?" she asked, confused. "Of course not. But the interview was just a formality. Must follow ministry employee regulations. The only things we care about are whether you're willing to work hard and whether you're already 14. And one more thing you'll learn soon," said Mrs. Bones, and turned as a young girl walked through the doorway that Ginny presumed led to the stables. "Ah, Susan! Good. You know Ginny Weasley?" Susan Bones crossed the room quickly, her galloping gait mimicking the way she must move when on horseback. She'd been practically born on a horse and had flown Abraxians before starting at Hogwarts, even though she'd never been on a broomstick. After Susan and Ginny exchanged pleasantries and left the entrance room for the stables, Ginny thought she understood at last. Why would anyone bother with a broomstick when there were such magnificent creatures in the world? A pair of palominos had just taken off from the paddock and were circling the grassy knoll, their magnificent wings beating, their proud heads moving from side to side as if they were talking with each other. Neither had saddles or bridles, but atop one was a young boy who directed them across the sky. A question from Susan interrupted her reverie. "Why did you want to work here? I thought you didn't fly." "I know how," Ginny said, "but I had an accident a few years back, so I haven't done much flying in the past 2 years or so. But Charlie, that's my brother, he worked here about 7 years ago and said that the grooms don't necessarily have to be able to fly. And of course," she said courageously, "I can learn." Susan looked like she was keeping a secret. "There are things you can do on the ground here," she said while they walked away from the main paddock and around the side of one of the stables. Ginny hadn't even been able to get a good impression of all the buildings they had passed, as Susan was moving with such speed, before they came to a large field with no fences, which bordered a forest. And there, galloping across the field, was a herd of unicorns. Ginny gasped. "You have unicorns here?" "Yes, and they stay on the ground," Susan pointed out. "I thought they were really hard to catch." "These were bred in captivity here. These past 12 years, they become an endangered species in parts of Eastern Europe, so we're trying a program to raise them on farms. They don't seem to mind, and while they're as fleet as the wild ones, they don't know they're already more or less captured, so they don't try to run away if..." "If what?" Ginny asked warily. "Why don't you go pet one?" said Susan, gesturing towards 3 unicorns lazing in the field not far from where they stood. Ginny took a few tentative steps forward. Would they really stay? Would they not run? She petted the unicorn that Professor Grubbly Plank had brought to school, and Hagrid had shown her how to braid the mane on a unicorn foal, but they were restrained, and up close those horns looked really big and slightly dangerous. She reached into her pocket for her wand and started reciting a stunning spell, although she doubted it would work on such a magnificent and magical creature. One of the unicorns looked up as she approached, while the others continued to lazily nibble at the grass. Ginny reached out her hand when she was still 10 feet away, and the magnificent animal seemed to move towards her as she approached him. He arched his head into her hand as if seeking her touch. He was as soft as velvet and as smooth as silk. Ginny met his soft brown eyes with hers, and if unicorns could talk, she'd have sworn she'd heard him say, "I know you." Dimly, she heard Susan applaud in the distance. "Good going, Weasley! I knew you'd be able to do it!" It wouldn't do to stand here and pet the unicorn all day. She had to return to Susan. She'd have the rest of the summer to spend with the unicorns, and she'd learn all their names and what kinds of sugars they liked, and how they wanted their manes and tails braided, and everything. "What did you mean about knowing I'd be able to pet them?" she asked as they walked towards the groom's dormitory. "Ginny, it's 2 weeks into summer. Didn't you wonder why we didn't have all the grooms we needed by now?" "Not really. Should I have?" "We're pretty much set with the Abraxian ponies, but we're really short of grooms who can work with the unicorns." "Why?" Ginny asked. "Wouldn't everyone want to work with them?" "They want to, that's for sure, but not as much as they want other things. You know that a number of witches and wizards board their horses here?" Ginny nodded. Charlie had told her that. Susan's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as they entered the whitewashed girls' dormitory. "One of the boarders keeps seducing the grooms, so they can't go near the unicorns anymore." Feeling slightly shocked, Ginny chose to ignore Susan's remark and began looking around the room instead. It was clean, with its 2 rows of 3 beds that lined the walls, and was decorated with prints of flowers. There was a pair of wash basins by the door, and instead of having curtains on the beds, as they were at school, soft white ones hung by each set of dressers, although they were pulled back for the day. Each bed had a different colored eiderdown and a matching rug by its side, and 4 of the dresser tops were cluttered with photographs, writing gloves, parchment, and quills. Ginny laid her new cloak on one of the beds, claiming it for herself. It was by a window that had a view of the field they'd just come from, and soft purple dressings. "That was Lydia's space. She left last week, the same day the letter from your mum arrived," Susan noted. "Now, let's go back to the office, so I can tell my mum you're fine with the unicorns, and she can finish up the ministry paperwork." They left the dormitory by the back exit, and walked through the narrow passage between the boys' and girls' dorms. Ginny glanced through the windows. The boys' living area sported blue curtains in their rooms, and striped wallpaper rather than flower print. They emerged at the edge of the paddock, where the 2 palominos still circled the blue sky above them. As they crossed back to the main office, Ginny saw 2 muggle horses cantering over the knoll, and her heart leapt into her throat. She would recognize that head of dark wild hair anywhere. Harry rode the horse into the paddock, while his companion headed directly for the stables. He circled the far edge before pulling up to a stop before them. "Ginny, it's great to see you," Harry greeted her with a wide grin. It was all Ginny could do to nod and smile back. As he chatted with Susan about his horse, Ginny studied his face. Despite his friendly grin, he looked tired and too thin. Ron had told her that the Dursleys practically starved him, and so she wasn't as surprised as she could have been. Neither was she surprised at the dark shadows under his eyes and the paleness of his skin. He hadn't spent much time outdoors since the Tri-Rosary tournament, and was bound to still be traumatized from the experience. Her heart ached, because despite all this, Harry was still the most beautiful boy she'd ever seen. "How's your mum and dad?" Harry asked, turning his bright green gaze upon her, and Ginny snapped out of her daze. "They're very well, thanks," she said. "Ron will be coming in a few days, too." "Yeah, I'm looking forward to it." Harry grinned. "It should be a lot of fun having him here." Ginny's heart sank a tiny bit, knowing that she wouldn't be included in the fun, but willed herself not to display her disappointment. She smiled back bravely. "Well, please excuse us, Harry. We have to get back to the office," Susan interrupted, glancing between the 2 of them with amusement. "Ginny still has to travel home to fetch her things." "Right. Sorry for keeping you," Harry said. He gathered the reins in his hand and turned the horse's head towards one of the stable buildings. Will you be back in time for supper?" he asked Ginny. "Oh, yes, I expect to," Ginny answered. "I'll see you at supper then. Please say hello to your parents for me." And with a wave, he set off for the stables, and Susan steered Ginny back to the office, chatting amicably about her future schedule. As Ginny took the portkey in her hand for her trip back to the Burrow, she considered that working for Harry might not be unpleasant after all. She was home for only 20 minutes to gather her things, but it felt like hours. She wanted to get back to the chaise, not just to see Harry, but to return to the unicorns. They needed her. She knew that. When she portkeyed back, she carried her things to the dorm and spent some time arranging her clothing neatly in the drawers. She added some trinkets to the room, as she always did in September at Hogwarts. Books, photos of her family waving at her, a tiny green frog Percy had won 3 years ago. Finally, she was settled in and could go to the stables for a look around. Ginny left the dorms, shutting and locking the door behind her, as Susan has instructed. She slid her wand into the top of her boot and headed towards the stables. It was a beautiful summer afternoon, shading into twilight. The sky was a deep turquoise blue, outlined in darker shades of indigo towards the horizon. The soft air rustled the leaves, and Ginny inhaled the scent of hay, grass, horses, and the thought that it would be very hard to be unhappy in a place like this. But Harry had looked unhappy. Not miserable exactly, just haunted. She wished she knew what was troubling him. Lost in thought, she wandered towards the larger of the stables and in through the open door. She found herself in a narrow corridor that led in between horse stalls, most of which were empty, although a pale grey horse watched her from a ways down with an inquisitive gaze. Everything in the stable gleamed beautifully: the shiny copper grooming brushes and combs on the walls, the multicolored ribbons that decorated the stalls. These horses had won plenty of awards. The grey horse down the corridor whickered softly, rustling its wings, and Ginny went to pet its nose, when she heard a noise and spun around. A solitary rider had entered the stable, leading a bridled horse behind him. The light was poor, and she could tell only that it was a boy about her age. For a moment she almost thought it was Harry, for the boy had the same slender build. But this boy was taller and much more fashionably turned out. He wore pale brown riding breeches, high black boots, and a short jacket. His hands were gloved, and a regulation helmet obscured his features. She watched, faintly curious, as he led his horse into the stall, patted its neck, and went out, shutting the door behind him. It was only when he moved to take his helmet off, and the fading light struck his spill of silver-blonde hair, that she recognized him and emitted a startled squeak. Draco Malfoy! Ever alert, he spun around, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Ginny's stomach twisted into an uncomfortable knot. Draco Malfoy. She hated him, had hated him on principle forever, and specifically since her second year, when he had humiliated her in front of Harry. He returned her shocked look with an appraising stare, a sneer curling the corners of his hard, narrow mouth. "Little Ginny Weasley," he drawled. "How you have grown." Ginny said nothing. She could think of nothing to say. Loathing and surprise rooted her feet to the ground. "I'm surprised to see you here," he said, sliding off one of his leather gloves. "Then again, maybe not. It doesn't surprise me that you need to pick up a little pocket change over the summer. I'm assuming you're the new groom." Ginny nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She hoped her glare spoke louder than words. "Of course you are," he purred, narrowing his grey eyes and sliding off his other glove. His hands were thin and very white. "You couldn't possibly afford to be a rider. How silly of me to forget." "I didn't realize you had to buy a position as a rider," Ginny shot back. "I thought you actually had to have some skill. How silly of me." Malfoy's eyes widened for a moment. Then he laughed. "You really have grown up," he said, and began walking towards her. She didn't move. There was no room to edge away. and to leave she would have to brush past him, something she was unwilling to do. Malfoy drew closer to her, so close that she could smell the scent of expensive cologne, horses, and sweat that clung to him. "Show me your hands," he said. She blinked at him. "What?" "Show me your hands," he repeated, and she was astonished that she did it, holding them out in front of her, palm down, as if she expected him to slap the backs of them with a ruler. He shoved the gloves he'd been holding into a pocket of his jacket and took her hands in his. Ginny almost jumped out of her skin. His hands were freezing. Not just cold, but freezing, as if he'd laid bars of ice against her skin. Surely that couldn't be normal? "Small hands," he drawled slowly. "Delicate hands, in fact." He tossed the blonde hair out of his eyes and grinned at her. "I could use a groom with hands like these." Ginny yanked her hands out of his and stuffed them in her pockets. "I assume you already have a groom, Malfoy. Surely you don't need two." "Now that's where you're wrong, love," he replied. "We Malfoys get 4 grooms apiece." "You're so spoilt," Ginny said without even thinking. To her surprise, Draco actually laughed at this. "I guess I was wrong about you," he said. "All those years I thought you were as dull as a troll. It's nice to see you've got a little bit of spark. An excellent quality in a groom. And in a girl, too," he added, and Ginny would have slapped his smirking face, but a voice, speaking out of the shadows, interrupted them first. "Malfoy." Ginny didn't even need to look to know that it was Harry's voice. She would have known his voice anywhere. She glanced up and saw him over Draco's shoulder, a shadow among the darker shadows of the stable. "Sod off, Potter," said Draco, not turning. "Can't you see I'm busy here?" "Right," said Harry, sounding amused. "In that case, you won't want to know that Gwen Comedy's father just arrived at the front gates. He looks right half off, too. Wonder why?" Draco stiffened all over, like a dog with raised hackles. He stepped away from Ginny, spun around, glared at Harry, and stalked out of the stables without another word. Ginny watched him go, feeling the after-effects of his presence like a sourness in the back of her throat. When she returned her gaze to Harry, he was looking at her with concern. "Sorry about Malfoy," he said. "There's nothing much we can do about him. His family's been riding here for ages." Ginny shook her head. "It's fine. Don't worry about it." Harry glanced around. In the dim light, his eyes looked black. "It's getting dark. About time to head over to the main house for supper. Want to come?" "Sure." She fell into step behind him as they left the stable. Outside, the sky had turned a crisp indigo black. The dim light made the shadows under Harry's eyes look even darker, and turned his irises to turquoise green. "What was all that about Gwen Comedy, then?" "She's a groom," said Harry, then paused. "Was a groom, I should say." "But she isn't any more?" "No." Harry kicked at a loose stone with his booted foot. "None of them want to be grooms anymore, after what Malfoy's done with them." "What does he do to them?" Ginny demanded, then flushed, remembering Draco's cold grasp on her wrists in the stables. She had a pretty good idea what he had did to them, actually. "Let's put it this way," said Harry shortly. "Once he's done with them, they won't be taking care of any more unicorns." "So he's the one who's been seducing all the grooms," Ginny said. Harry looked at her in surprise, then shrugged. "All the ones he fancies. And he has pretty wide-ranging tastes." "Well, why don't you get boy grooms for him, then?" Ginny demanded, as they rounded the side of the high thicket of trees shading the unicorn compound from view. Harry laughed. "We have the same problem with them, too," he said. Ginny gaped at him, stopping in her tracks. "Wide-ranging tastes," Harry said, and grinned, evidently amused by the look on her face. "Like I told you." "You know, Harry," Ginny said thoughtfully, "there's something... well, maybe it's nothing." Harry paused and looked at her. "What is it?" he asked curiously, and she appreciated the way he took her seriously and never dismissed her. You can tell me. There's something about Malfoy, she said. Something weird. Well, there's a newsflash, he said, but with a friendly smile. No, I mean something weird in a sinister way, she said, knowing she sounded ridiculous. When he touched me, his hands were freezing cold. I haven't felt anything like that since I touched Riddle's diary, she finished quickly. She saw Harry flinch a little, and then look thoughtful. I'm sure Malfoy's into some dark stuff, he said. That wouldn't surprise me at all. It's just that... But suddenly, he was interrupted by a horrible sound, a high, undulating scream that cut through the night like a knife. It was coming from the area just past the stand of trees, where the unicorns were kept. Harry went white. The unicorns, he whispered, reached out, and grabbed Ginny by the hand. Come on, he said, and they were running. Harry ahead, half dragging her. She was reminded of running from the Chamber of Secrets, Harry ahead of her, covered in blood. They broke out into the clearing. It was almost entirely dark now. The unicorns inside their enclosure were a milling white mass. Harry dropped Ginny's hand and vaulted over the low fence. She bit down hard on her lip, willing herself not to call him back. She saw the tip of his wand flare alight as he walked among them, and they seemed to calm, whether because of his presence or because of whatever threat had frightened them in the first place had fled, and she was not sure which. He came over to the fence and gestured towards her. She approached and leaned on the fence, looking anxiously into his face. What happened? She demanded. He shook his head, looking very tense. I don't know, he said, but one of the unicorns is injured. He held out a hand towards her, and she saw that 2 of his fingers were shimmering silver. She gasped, and Harry nodded, looking sick and unhappy. I'm going to run back and get Lupin, he said, vaulting back over the fence and landing beside her in the grass. It might be nothing, but have you got your wand with you? She nodded. Of course. Good. Can you stay here and keep an eye out? You can send up sparks if anything happens. I'll be right back, he said, and with that, took off at a run back towards the main building. Ginny sighed, bent down, and slipped her wand out of her boot. She supposed she should be glad that Harry didn't feel he had to hang around and protect her. It was nice that he thought that he knew that she could take care of herself. Still, she straightened up and looked around uneasily. The clearing was quite dark at this point, the unicorns barely visible in the gloom. She raised her wand and said, Lumos, and it flared to life. She saw it, just out of the corner of her eye, a beaten-down trail leading off into the woods. Calling it a trail, she thought to herself, might be a bit generous. The grass had been trampled down recently, judging from the state of the foliage that had been crushed under someone's foot. She glanced around behind her, and then back at the trail. Curiosity getting the better of her at last, she raised her lighted wand, stepped onto the trail, and headed into the dark stand of trees. And that is actually where this fanfiction stops, guys, as it was unfinished. So as always, thank you so much for joining me. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and if you are interested in supporting me monetarily, I have a Patreon where I release my spicy art once a month, along with a whole bunch of other like pop culture takes that I do not release here on YouTube. And for my higher tiers, I have my smut that I have written and read, as well as some boudoir shoots as well. So there's that, but if that is not to your liking, I also have a Ko-fi. Both of those are in my about page or section on this page here on YouTube. And yeah, I hope you have a good night. Again, thank you for joining me, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.